friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. Today, Joy is going to talk about her book called The Grand Design, and she's got other historical novels as well. And if you've ever been to the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, in White Sulphur Springs, you will love this book about Dorothy Draper, the woman whose decorative stamp is all over it. Joy, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Her love of storytelling is a direct result of her parents' insistence that she read books or write stories instead of watching television. Yay, parents, that's awesome. Her interest in family history was fostered by her relatives' habit of recounting tales of ancestors' lives. She's a full-time mom and writer, and she formerly served as a marketing director for a wealth management company. She holds a BA in journalism and public relations from Marshall University and an MMC in mass communications from the University of South Carolina. Now she resides in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband, John, her children, Olivia and John. I was fascinated by this book. I've always been fascinated by the Greenbrier, and of course knew a little bit about Dorothy Draper, but nothing like you've written. What prompted you to choose this as a subject?
Well, my family has been in West Virginia for 8 generations, so far back that it was before it was West Virginia. And so we have just a long history in West Virginia. And even though I grew up in Charlotte, the rest of my family was in Charleston. And so we were up there all the time. My grandparents are actually from Boone County, West Virginia, and moved to Charleston later. And so we just have such a long history there. And it's really my second home. And to be honest, the moment I became an author, I knew I wanted to write a book set in West Virginia that would highlight the beauty of the state and the beauty of the people in the state. And, the Greenbrier has always been a place of fascination for me. We've been going and doing family get-togethers there for generations. And so from the time I was a little kid, I recall, going on the history tours and learning all I could learn about history. I just loved it since I was small. So, at one point, what it was is the last time, actually, it was the year before my paternal grandfather passed away. We were there with my whole family, and we go to the Greenbrier with my whole family. Both sides like each other, so they go together. Yeah. And my grandpa's, I was sitting there having a tea. The Greenbrier, they have high tea for all the guests. And we were sitting there in the Victorian writing room, which is arguably Dorothy Draper's most iconic design at the Greenbrier. And we're sitting there talking about the history tour that I'd just taken for the 100th time. Thank you, Dr. Conti, who is the Greenbrier's historian. But I was sitting there talking to my grandpas about it, and they said, well, you can't really separate Dorothy Draper and the Greenbrier. It's just their legacies are so intrinsically linked, and they're so right. And so the light bulb kind of went off, and I was like, that's the story I want to tell.
Yeah, that's great. But that's your third book, right?
It is, yes.
Okay, all right. So give us a short synopsis of the story.
Okay, so it's set in 1908 and 1946 at the Greenbrier, and it centers on Dorothy Draper, about how the Greenbrier the influence the Greenbrier had in her life and a love she found there as a young woman influenced her shift from Gilded Age iron heiress to CEO, which would have been a really big leap back then. Very scandalous.
It is not a nonfiction. I mean, even though a lot of what you've written is true, that she was the person who transformed the hotel after Second World War. That's true, but you have fictionalized her life in such a way that you've invented maybe some backstory for her. Is this correct?
Right, yes. So with all of my historical fiction, what I do is I take all the fact that I know about the topic. So everything I can get in newspaper archives, in biographies, in letters, I really dig deep with my research. And what I do is I take usually a snippet of someone's life when they're right on the crux of changing something. I find that so fascinating. But what I do with all of my books is I take what I know to be true, and all I do is I fill in the gaps with fiction. Okay. And the same is true here. So I took all I knew about her, all the resources, and they were still wise. And that's how it is with, I think, a lot of historical accounts. Even if you look at your, ancestry,
Mhm.
there's still a lot of whys and things you're never going to know. And so those holes I fill in fiction. And that's what, it is obviously a work of historical fiction. It's told in first person. So it is from the voice of Dorothy. And of course, I am not Dorothy. So yes, it is. It's definitely a work of fiction, but I tried to stay as close to her character as I could, as close to the historical fact of the Greenbrier as I could as well. And I had some great resources for that. Dr. Conti, the Greenbrier historian, was absolutely a wonderful resource, as well as Mr. Varney read it and just raved about it too. So that was so special to me.
Right. All right. Tell us the true story, like how she, what the hotel was like, because some people may not know that it was a hospital and so forth, and what her charge was when she was hired to restore it.
Sure. So the Greenbrier has a very, very, deep and long history. Started in the 1770s as kind of a spring resort that people would come to for healing. And over time, it became a place you went socially, that all basically the aristocracy in America, if you could call it that, all gathered there. And if you weren't there, then, your influence, you weren't anybody, I guess, back then.
Mhm.
All the well-to-dos went there, and politicians. And so, leading up to Dorothy's redecorating of the hotel, you had first the cottages that were developed there for these summer retreats, and then you had an old hotel called the Grand Central that stood there for a long time during the Civil War era, and actually was used as an army hospital for both sides during the Civil War. And then after that, in 1912, the Greenbrier, as it stands today, was built because the old hotel had no air conditioning. So they're trying to bring it into kind of the modern time and let it be a year-round place to come. But what happened was they built this fine resort, and then the world wars hit. And in World War II, the government actually bought the Greenbrier, or took it over, and the Greenbrier became Ashford General Hospital. And it totally was transformed from this, playground for the social elite to completely stripped of all of its finery. It was a true army hospital. And so the C&O Railroad, after the war, was given the opportunity to buy it back. And they did. And it could have just, at that point, just gone into disrepair if the C&O had said no. But they took a chance on it. They remembered the importance of what it had been before. And so the CEO of the C&O said, Robert Young, he was saying that, we need someone to come and put life back into this place. Who is the right person for the job? And it was pretty clear who that was, because Dorothy Draper was the Martha Stewart of her era. So she was basically an American princess. So she was famous. She was also very famed for her design work. At that point, she was getting written up in every paper for every, project she did. And so to him, it made a lot of sense, because you hire her, she comes in and splashes the walls with this wonderful, colorful design work that is going to be absolutely covered in the papers because of the design work, but also she has the star power to bring back, the Kennedys and the Vanderbilts and, Bing Crosby and all of these people that can infuse it again with kind of this star-studded, the star-studded group of people that used to be. And so she redecorates, and she does bring it back to what it was, and then some.
You said a minute ago that there was the Gilded Age. Explain what that is for some people who may not know.
There's some discrepancy on that, but generally speaking, I think people generally classify it as 1880s through the early part of the 1900s. So I generally like to say there's some, you're looking at like the end of Victorian, the beginning of the Edwardian eras. And it's a time in history where you really see a lot of, you see like in New York, the Fifth Avenue mansions,
Mhm.
the Vanderbilts, the crazy parties they had, the Astors, and kind of the war between them. That kind of era is the Gilded Age.
So sort of the robber baron tycoon era.
Right.
Yeah, I understand. All right, so you've set this, I mean, the whole thing, and just because of the history of the Greenbrier, is set against World War I, World War II, the Depression, and the Gilded Age. How did those events impact the characters that you either created or Dorothy Draper herself?
In the Gilded Age, during that time, you had a lot of societal, like it was on the cusp of societal change. You still had those kind of the big money, groups, and the societal kind of constraints that Dorothy would have felt being a creative in that world. And then between that time and the time she comes back and redecorates, she's experienced, like you mentioned, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, and also personally for her, a high profile divorce from FDR's polio doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right, actually, he asked for a divorce the week before the Depression, the stock market crash. So right then, she became, after experiencing, even in World War I, she was known for sort of ignoring the wars. And I don't mean that to mean she didn't want to think about them. It was that she, I think, doing my research about her, I think she was an empath. So she felt very deeply. So it impacted her greatly to know that, for instance, her best friend's son was fighting and that he may not return. And all these people she had known weren't coming back and were impacted. And it made her, very upset to the point where she couldn't function. And so she wasn't trying to ignore it like that, but just in order to function, she had to kind of like put up some barriers. And I kind of associate with that. I don't really watch the news regularly because it does impact me personally. I feel like it dampens my spirit, and I need to kind of protect that,
Yeah.
So I understand that. And so in World War II, the same thing kind of happened with her. And, that era, those people that lived during that time had such collective trauma. And so one of the things she did to sort of cope was she really became a student of the power of positive thinking. And a funny side fact too is she also had her assistant cut the newspapers and all the bad news out of the newspapers before it got to her desk, which is funny. It would have been a small newspaper, I think, but who knows? Right. So she does that, but then right around the time she starts her business in the late, it was 1929 was when the Architectural Clearinghouse was launched. And that was, her first endeavor into business. But she, following the wars and everything else, she becomes a student of the power of positive thought. And you can see that in her design work. So all of her design work is colorful and joyful. And she sort of took on this mission that she couldn't change the fact that we were going to war. She couldn't change the stock market. She really couldn't change the fact that her husband, left her and, ended up marrying another decorator 20 years her junior. She couldn't do anything about that. But what she could do was paint the walls the colors that made her happy. She could create spaces that maybe for a moment when people walked through the door would lift them out of whatever they were going through and give them a smile just for a minute. She wasn't didn't think design was going to, for instance, wipe away everything you went through. Yeah. But she just thought that if you could create spaces where people have everything around them is joyful, then perhaps just for that moment that they're there, they'll see hope and they will see that the future holds brighter things.
Did that aspect of her personality, her desire to lead a life that was, maybe chafed against all that she'd been brought up to be, did that also fascinate you? Is that something that, kind of spoke to you?
Yes, definitely. I think that's really the catalyst for the book is the why. What was it that prompted her to do such a thing? Because she grew up in Tuxedo Park, which so the Tuckerman family that's her maiden name is Tuckerman. And they were on one side iron heirs and on the other side shipping heirs. And so they were a conglomeration of two huge fortunes. And they were of old New York money. So they would have been of the settler side. So if you ever watch Gilded Age HBO, it would have been like I forget their names, but the Dutch people.
Uh-huh.
It would have been of that set. And so she grew up they had a home in New York near Fifth Avenue, but their main residence was in Tuxedo Park, which is 40 minutes, I believe it's northeast of the city.
Mhm.
And they did that for a reason. If you actually look at Tuxedo Park, it still stands today. It looks like a bunch of Fifth Avenue mansions conglomerated into a community.
Uh-huh.
And they were hiding, I believe, from everybody else because they were of the set that they didn't like to be spoken of. It wasn't proper to have your name in the newspapers for your wealth. Like that was just considered poor form. And so I believe that this is kind of their way of kind of grouping together elsewhere to live their lives.
Mhm.
But yeah, she grew up. So Emily Post grew up in her same neighborhood. And when she published her book, it was a huge scandal. You did not work back then as a society, as an heiress. It's not like Paris Hilton or something like that nowadays, where it's widely accepted that you're an heiress and an entrepreneur. Like that did not happen. If you were working, that signified that your family was on the brink of ruin.
Right.
That you couldn't make a good match or something like that, that something was wrong with you. And so it was very, very scandalous when she did step out on her own. And I've always thought, in my research, that when you have a gift like she did, and it is not encouraged, that you may realize you have it, but others aren't going to tell you. And so it would have taken someone else, I believe, to have spotted her ingenuity and her skill and commented to her that what she was feeling and what she knew as her gift truly was that she just wasn't feeling it on her own. And so that's one of the things that really prompted me to write the book, is kind of the why, what prompted her to risk, being ostracized from her family and everyone she knew in society, to do this, to be this person and to be famous, which was horrifying to those people back then. You did not want to be.
Do you think that that there might have actually been a love affair like you have fictionalized?
Probably. You think about even ourselves, right? You have, when you look at historical records, even for ancestors or your parents, even, you see, birth, marriage, children, whatever maybe you have accomplished else, maybe a few other line items, and when you pass away. And there's not a whole lot of discussion, generally speaking, even among peers. My friends aren't sitting around talking about who they loved before their husbands, or who they, the relationships they had in the past. And I think there are those connections that you're just never going to know. And I do know that later in life, after Dorothy was divorced, she did, she had several love affairs. And so,
scandalous as well.
Right. Yes. She always had two attractive men on her arm at all times with at all of her events. And she did, in fact, have a relationship with a race car driver. So it's just, it's an interesting thing, but I the whys are something always of interest for me. And that's something that really drives my books.
Yeah. So the way you wrote it in 2 time frames, you've married her love of the building, the hotel itself, with the love of her life, so to speak, and her love of color and wanting to be, something different. I think that's a fascinating way to have put it all together.
Well, thank you. Yes, it was my first time writing dual timeline, and I worried because sometimes when I read dual timeline, I like one a lot better than the other. And so I was hoping that I could make it interesting enough for readers to like both timelines.
Right. But this is not your first book, so, or the first one of historical fiction. What is it about that genre that fascinates you?
I think from a young kid, what really did it for me and made me love history is the fact that my family, they talk about our ancestors as if they're still living. We are like family heirloom hoarders, I would say. We have so many things from our family, and that prompts discussion, and we display them. And from a young age, I was just fascinated when I heard about, well, my debut novel is about my family, about a family of artists in the Gilded Age Bronx who get inducted into an artist society, like a Parisian salon. And they're based on my family history, because those are stories that I heard from the time I was a little kid. And I would just always marveled at that. And then my parents took me to historic sites all the time as a kid too. And just, there's something really fascinating about it. It's almost like stepping into a fantasy world when you're writing history, because you're never going to see it for yourself. But at the same time, the difference, I guess, between this and fantasy is you can see pictures. And so it actually did happen. And for a long time, I watched old movies and I think, wow, that would be so cool to just, I love modern medicine. So I don't think I want to like fully go back.
Yeah, you don't want to live in Outlander, but you like reading about it, right?
I do. I love Outlander, but I also would, I don't want to, I wouldn't want to, I would have to be wealthy, number one. And I, would want to just go back for a short period of time, because, I think a lot of people, when you look at the Gilded Age, one of the interesting things is there was such, there still is, but there was such a huge disparity of wealth.
Oh, yeah.
That's especially if you just even look at New York City back then, and it was enormous. And one of the cool things about being able to write during this era, even with my debut novel, especially kind of delved into this a lot, was what the middle class was doing. Because it's all, you can look back at the Gilded Age and think, wow, like I'd love to travel back there. And what you're thinking is, I'd love to travel back there as a Vanderbilt. You're not thinking I'd love to travel back there as someone working at
in a tenement, right?
Yeah, in a tenement home.
Right, exactly.
Contracting disease and, all this. So I think that I am fascinated with kind of just like all the nuance of that era, because in history in general, things were done differently.
Are you working on a new novel?
I'll have a novel out in May, probably, I'm guessing May, from now until 2025. So my book coming out in May is called All the Pretty Places. And it is, again, about my family history. And I'm super excited for this one.
That's great. And what did you say about all through 2025?
Yes.
You got another book beyond that?
I'm writing it now.
Wow.
It is about the Grove Park Inn in Asheville.
Oh my, what a wonderful place. That's great. So what's your writing routine? You're a mom and you've got obviously obligations like picking your daughter up from swim practice. How do you get your writing done?
It's a lot easier now that my kids are in elementary school. But the funny thing is, generally speaking, I'm just one of these people who, when I'm writing, I look like I crawl out of a cave. So I generally drop the kids off. I go for a quick run. I grab a cup of coffee and I start writing. And I'll sometimes write all day until from the bus. And so it just kind of depends on the day. I always have, you have groceries to do and laundry to do and all that. So sometimes that's impossible, but that's just kind of ideally what I do. But when I was first starting, my daughter was 6 months old when I got my first 2-book deal. And I would write during nap time, and I would just write an hour and a half or however long she slept. Yeah. I kept that up for quite some time. Until the kids were in school. So, you can be amazed, this, you can be amazed at what you can do in a short amount of time if you're disciplined, and that's all the time you got.
Do you have, like one publisher who's publishing all your books, and do you have like a deal so that you're supposed to complete another book by a certain number of, certain time?
Yes. So my first 2-book deal was with HarperCollins, and it was with the Harper imprint. And I'm still with HarperCollins now, although I've moved over to Harper Muse, which is a newer imprint. The Grand Design, All the Pretty Places, and the next 2 books will all be with Harper Muse. So, and I have I believe, I could be getting this wrong. I believe my deadline for turning in this next book is April. So the tricky part is, what I find hard is that I was in publicity before. So that's always in the back of my mind is, okay, well, it's time to promote, I'm still obviously talking about the Grand Design and will for some time. I have speaking engagements well into 2023 and with that book, but at the same time, I'll be starting to promote All the Pretty Places soon. And then I'm also supposed to write a book, and it's supposed to be turned in April. So it's pretty tricky. You're, juggling 3 books at a time.
So working on a deadline is also a high motivator, shall we say?
It is, yeah. And I
Yeah.
don't really, normally I don't, I normally have, it's been weird. I've worked ahead most of the time. So normally it's like I'm working on a book for 2 years in advance and I already have the one done, but it just has worked out where
Mhm.
that's not happening anymore. So yes, deadline it is.
Yeah, a lot of times people say that a book germinates for, 7 to 10 years before they get it finished. You can hardly afford to do that.
No. But I will say the good thing is I've had a lot of interest over the years. And I'm one of these people who, strangely enough, my husband will find me doing like newspaper archival research and he'll be like, well, what are you working on? And I'll say, oh, I don't know. Like, for instance, there's a Carhartt, the Carhartt brand.
Mhm.
Um, he had a mansion down here in Rock Hill and it was his summer home and it's just ruins now. And so I'm fascinated by that. I want to know what it looked like during the heyday. So that's what I was doing. My husband came over. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm looking for the Carhartt mansion. I want to see what it looked like when it was standing. And I spent hours looking at it because I was just fascinated. And so this happens a lot to me where I'll see something and I'll just think, wow, I want to know more just personally for my own interests. And so I think that even though I am doing a book a year and therefore don't have the time to kind of just let something germinate, I guess, intentionally.
Mhm.
Subconsciously, a lot of these topics are things that I've been interested in and researching on and off for years and years.
Do you ever find yourself going down the research rabbit hole so that all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, I got to stop and go start writing it?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, that's the whole thing. Actually, when I wrote my first historical, I remember I'm a huge Outlander fan. I know you referenced
Yeah.
Outlander. And I was on Twitter back then. I'm not anymore. And Diana Gabaldon also is on Twitter. And so one time I was struggling with, I had so much information in my head and you want to include, that's the mistake I think a lot of first time writers make is you feel like you got to include everything in that book, like everything you've read about it, it needs to be in there. And I asked her, I said, how do you do this? Like, how do you stop researching and start writing? And she just said, at some point you gather the information you need to start, and then you stop a bunch of times and keep researching throughout. And that's totally true.
I think we're about out of time, but before we go, I assume all the people can get your books through Amazon, through Barnes and Nobles, all the usual sources, places to buy books, bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for joining us. And I hope you all will please pick up The Grand Design as well as Joy's other books. You'll have to come again when your next book is out.
I would love it. Thank you so much, Carter, for having me.
All right. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.